Charity. William Morris wrote a poem called Love is Enough, and someone is said to have reviewed it briefly in the words, "It isn't." Such has been the burden of this book. The natural loves are not self-sufficient. Something else, at first vaguely described as decency and common sense, but later revealed as goodness, and finally as the whole Christian life in one particular relation, must come to the help of the mere feeling, if the feeling is to be kept sweet. To say this is not to belittle the natural loves, but to indicate where their real glory lies. It is no disparagement to a garden to say that it will not fence and weed itself, nor prune its own fruit trees, nor roll and cut its own lawns. A garden is a good thing, but that is not the sort of goodness it has. It will remain a garden, as distinct from a wilderness only, if someone does all these things to it. Its real glory is of quite a different kind. The very fact that it needs constant weeding and pruning bears witness to that glory. It teems with life, it glows with colour and smells like heaven, and puts forward at every hour of a summer day beauties which man could never have created and could not even, on his own resources, have imagined. If you want to see the difference between its contribution and the gardener's, put the commonest weed it grows side by side with his hoes, rakes, shears, and packet of weed killer. You have put beauty, energy, and fecundity beside dead, sterile things. Just so our decency and common sense show grey and death-like beside the geniality of love. And when the garden is in its full glory, the gardener's contributions to that glory will still have been, in a sense, paltry compared with those of nature. Without life springing from the earth, without rain, light, and heat descending from the sky, he could do nothing. When he has done all, he has merely encouraged here and discouraged there powers and beauties that have a different source. But his share, though small, is indispensable and laborious. When God planted a garden, he set a man over it and set the man under himself. When he planted the garden of our nature and caused the flowering, fruiting loves to grow there, he set our will to dress them. Compared with them, it is dry and cold, and unless his grace comes down like the rain and the sunshine, we shall use this tool to little purpose. But its laborious and largely negative services are indispensable. If they were needed when the garden was still paradisal, how much more now when the soil has gone sour and the worst weeds seem to thrive on it best? But heaven forbid we should work in the spirit of prigs and stoics. While we hack and prune, we know very well that what we are hacking and pruning is big with a splendour and vitality which our rational will could never of itself have supplied. To liberate that splendour, to let it become fully what it is trying to be, to have tall trees instead of scrubby tangles and sweet apples instead of crabs, is part of our purpose, but only part. For now, we must face a topic that I have long postponed. Hitherto, hardly anything has been said in this book about our natural loves as rivals to the love of God. Now the question can no longer be avoided. There were two reasons for my delay. One, already hinted, is that this question is not the place at which most of us need to begin. It is seldom, at the outset, addressed to our condition. For most of us, the true rivalry lies between the self and the human other, not yet between the human other and God. It is dangerous to press upon a man the duty of getting beyond earthly love when his real difficulty lies in getting so far. And it is no doubt easy enough to love the fellow creature less, and to imagine that this is happening because we are learning to love God more. when the real reason may be quite different. We may be only mistaking the decays of nature for the increase of grace. Many people do not find it really difficult to hate their wives or mothers. Monsieur Mauriac, in a fine scene, pictures the other disciples stunned and bewildered by this strange command, but not Judas. He laps it up easily. But to have stressed the rivalry earlier in this book would have been premature in another way also. The claim to divinity which our loves so easily make can be refuted without going so far as that. The loves prove that they are unworthy to take the place of God by the fact that they cannot even remain themselves and do what they promise to do without God's help. Why prove that some petty princeling is not the lawful emperor, when without the emperor's support he cannot even keep his subordinate throne and make peace in his own little province for half a year? Even for their own sakes, the loves must submit to be second things if they are to remain the things they want to be. In this yoke lies their true freedom. They are taller when they bow. For when God rules in a human heart, though he may sometimes have to remove certain of its native authorities altogether, he often continues others in their offices, and by subjecting their authority to his, gives it for the first time a firm basis. Emerson has said, when half gods go, the gods arrive. That is a very doubtful maxim. Better say, when God arrives, and only then, the half-gods can remain. Left to themselves, they either vanish or become demons. Only in his name can they, with beauty and security, wield their little tridents. The rebellious slogan, all for love, is really love's death warrant, date of execution, for the moment left blank. But the question of the rivalry, for these reasons long postponed, must now be treated. In any earlier period, except the 19th century, it would have loomed large throughout a book on this subject. If the Victorians needed the reminder that love is not enough, older theologians were always saying very loudly that natural love is likely to be a great deal too much. The danger of loving our fellow creatures too little was less present to their minds than that of loving them idolatrously. In every wife, mother, child, and friend, they saw a possible rival to God. So, of course, does our Lord. Luke 14:26. There is one method of dissuading us from inordinate love of the fellow creature which I find myself forced to reject at the very outset. I do so with trembling, for it met me in the pages of a great saint and a great thinker to whom my own glad debts are incalculable. In words which can still bring tears to the eyes, St. Augustine describes the desolation in which the death of his friend Nebridius plunged him. Confessions 4:10. Then he draws a moral. This is what comes, he says, of giving one's heart to anything but God. All human beings pass away. Do not let your happiness depend on something you may lose. If love is to be a blessing, not a misery, it must be for the only beloved who will never pass away. Of course, this is excellent sense. Don't put your goods in a leaky vessel. Don't spend too much on a house you may be turned out of. And there is no man alive who responds more naturally than I to such canny maxims. I am a safety-first creature. Of all arguments against love, none make so strong an appeal to my nature as careful. This might lead you to suffering. To my nature, my temperament, yes, not to my conscience. When I respond to that appeal, I seem to myself to be 1,000 miles away from Christ. If I am sure of anything, I am sure that his teaching was never meant to confirm my congenital preference for safe investments and limited liabilities. I doubt whether there is anything in me that pleases him less. And who could conceivably begin to love God on such a prudential ground because the security, so to speak, is better? Who could even include it among the grounds for loving? Would you choose a wife or a friend if it comes to that? Would you choose a dog in this spirit? One must be outside the world of love, of all loves, before one thus calculates. Eros, lawless Eros, preferring the beloved to happiness, is more like love himself than this. I think that this passage in the Confessions is less a part of St. Augustine's Christendom than a hangover from the high-minded pagan philosophies in which he grew up. It is closer to Stoic apathy or Neoplatonic mysticism than to charity. We follow one who wept over Jerusalem and at the grave of Lazarus, and loving all, yet had one disciple whom in a special sense he loved. St. Paul has a higher authority with us than St. Augustine. St. Paul, who shows no feeling that he ought not so to have suffered if Epaphroditus had died in Philem 2:27. Even if it were granted that insurances against heartbreak were our highest wisdom, does God himself offer them? Apparently not. Christ comes at last to say, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" There is no escape along the lines St. Augustine suggests, nor along any other lines. There is no safe investment. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. I believe that the most lawless and inordinate loves are less contrary to God's will than the self-invited and self-protective lovelessness. It is like hiding the talent in a napkin, and for much the same reason. I knew there that thou wert a hard man. Christ did not teach and suffer that we might become, even in the natural loves, more careful of our own happiness. If a man is not uncalculating towards the earthly beloveds whom he has seen, he is none the more likely to be so towards God whom he has not. We shall draw nearer to God, not by trying to avoid the sufferings inherent in all loves, but by accepting them and offering them to him, throwing away all defensive armor. If our hearts need to be broken, and if he chooses this as the way in which they should break, so be it. It remains certainly true that all natural loves can be inordinate. Inordinate does not mean insufficiently cautious, nor does it mean too big. It is not a quantitative term. It is probably impossible to love any human being simply too much. We may love him too much in proportion to our love for God, but it is the smallness of our love for God, not the greatness of our love for the man, that constitutes the inordinacy. But even this must be refined upon. Otherwise, we shall trouble some who are very much on the right road, but alarmed because they cannot feel towards God so warm a sensible emotion as they feel for the earthly beloved. It is much to be wished, at least I think so, that we all, at all times, could. We must pray that this gift should be given us. But the question The question whether we are loving God or the earthly beloved more is not, so far as concerns our Christian duty, a question about the comparative intensity of two feelings. The real question is which, when the alternative comes, do you serve or choose or put first? To which claim does your will in the last resort yield? And so often, our Lord's own words are both far fiercer and far more tolerable than those of the theologians. He says nothing about guarding against earthly loves for fear we might be hurt. He says something that cracks like a whip about trampling them all underfoot the moment they hold us back from following him. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. But how are we to understand the word hate? That love himself should be commanding what we ordinarily mean by hatred, commanding us to cherish resentment, to gloat over another's misery, to delight in injuring him, is almost a contradiction in terms. I think our Lord, in the sense here intended, hated St. Peter when he said, "Get thee behind me." To hate is to reject, to set one's face against, to make no concession to the beloved when the beloved utters, however sweetly and however pitiably, the suggestions of the devil. A man, said Jesus, who tries to serve two masters will hate the one and love the other. It is not surely mere feelings of aversion and liking that are here in question. He will adhere to, consent to, work for the one and not for the other. Consider again, I loved Jacob and I hated Esau. How is the thing called God's hatred of Esau displayed in the actual story? Not at all as we may expect. There is, of course, no ground for assuming that Esau made a bad end and was a lost soul. The Old Testament here as elsewhere has nothing to say about such matters. And from all we are told, Esau's earthly life was, in every ordinary sense, a good deal more blessed than Jacob's. It is Jacob who has all the disappointments, humiliations, terrors, and bereavements. But he has something which Esau has not. He is a patriarch. He hands on the Hebraic tradition, transmits the vocation and the blessing, becomes an ancestor of our Lord. The loving of Jacob seems to mean the acceptance of Jacob for a high and painful vocation, the hating of Esau, his rejection. He is turned down, fails to make the grade, is found useless for the purpose. So, in the last resort, we must turn down or disqualify our nearest and dearest when they come between us and our obedience to God. Heaven knows it will seem to them sufficiently like hatred. We must not act on the pity we feel. We must be blind to tears and deaf to pleadings. I will not say that this duty is hard. Some find it too easy. Some hard almost beyond endurance. What is hard for all is to know when the occasion for such hating has arisen. Our temperaments deceive us. The meek and tender, uxorious husbands, submissive wives, doting parents, dutiful children will not easily believe that it has ever arrived. Self-assertive people with a dash of the bully in them will believe it too soon. That is why it is of such extreme importance so to order our loves that it is unlikely to arrive at all. How this could come about we may see on a far lower level when the cavalier poet, going to the wars, says to his mistress, I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honour more. There are women to whom the plea would be meaningless. Honour would be just one of those silly things that men talk about, a verbal excuse for, therefore an aggravation of, the offence against love's law, which the poet is about to commit. Lovelace can use it with confidence because his lady is a cavalier lady, who already admits as he does the claims of honour. He does not need to hate her, to set his face against her, because he and she acknowledge the same law. They have agreed, and understood each other on this matter long before. The task of converting her to a belief in honour is not now when the decision is upon them to be undertaken. It is this prior agreement which is so necessary when a far greater claim than that of honour is at stake. It is too late when the crisis comes to begin telling a wife or husband or mother or friend that your love all along had a secret reservation under God, or so far as a higher love permits. They ought to have been warned, not, to be sure, explicitly, but by the implication of 1,000 talks, by the principle revealed in 100 decisions upon small matters. Indeed, a real disagreement on this issue should make itself felt early enough to prevent a marriage or a friendship from existing at all. The best love of either sort is not blind. Oliver Elton, speaking of Carlyle and Mill, said that they differed about justice, and that such a difference was naturally fatal to any friendship worthy of the name. If all, quite seriously all, for love is implicit in the beloved's attitude, his or her love is not worth having. It is not related in the right way to love himself. And this brings me to the foot of the last steep ascent this book must try to make. We must try to relate the human activities called loves to that love which is God a little more precisely than we have yet done. The precision can, of course, be only that of a model or a symbol, certain to fail us in the long run, and even while we use it, requiring correction from other models. The humblest of us, in a state of grace, can have some knowledge by acquaintance, some tasting of love himself, but man, even at his highest sanctity and intelligence, has no direct knowledge about the ultimate being, only analogies. We cannot see light, though by light we can see. Statements about God are extrapolations from the knowledge of other things which the divine illumination enables us to know. I labour these depreciations because, in what follows, my efforts to be clear and not intolerably lengthy may suggest a confidence which I by no means feel. I should be mad if I did. Take it as one man's reverie, almost one man's myth. If anything in it is useful to you, use it. If anything is not, never give it a second thought. God is love. Again, herein is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us. 1 John 4:10. We must not begin with mysticism, with the creature's love for God, or with the wonderful forestates of the fruition of God vouchsafed to some in their earthly life. We begin at the real beginning, with love as the divine energy. This primal love is gift love. In God, there is no hunger that needs to be filled, only plenteousness that desires to give. The doctrine that God was under no necessity to create is not a piece of dry scholastic speculation, it is essential. Without it, we can hardly avoid the conception of what I can only call a managerial God, a being whose function of nature is to run the universe, who stands to it as a headmaster to a school or a hotelier to a hotel. But to be sovereign of the universe is no great matter to God. In himself, at home in the land of the Trinity, he is sovereign of a far greater realm. We must keep always before our eyes that vision of Lady Julian's, in which God carried in his hand a little object like a nut, and that nut was all that is made. God, who needs nothing, loves into existence wholly superfluous creatures in order that he may love and perfect them. He creates the universe, already foreseeing, or should we say seeing, there are no tenses in God, the buzzing cloud of flies about the cross, the flayed back pressed against the uneven stake, the nails driven through the mesial nerves, the repeated incipient suffocation as the body droops, the repeated torture of back and arms, as it is time and time, for breath's sake hitched up. If I may dare the biological image, God is a host who deliberately creates his own parasites, causes us to be that we may exploit and take advantage of him. Herein is love. This is the diagram of love himself, the inventor of all loves. God, as creator of nature, implants in us both gift loves and need loves. The gift loves are natural images of himself, proximities to him by resemblance, which are not necessarily, and in all men, proximities of approach. A devoted mother, a beneficent ruler or teacher may give and give, continually exhibiting the likeness without making the approach. The need loves, so far as I have been able to see, have no resemblance to the love which God is. They are rather correlatives, opposites, not as evil is the opposite of good, of course, but as the form of the blancmange is an opposite to the form of the mould. But in addition to these natural loves, God can bestow a far better gift, or rather, since our minds must divide and pigeonhole two gifts. He communicates to men a share of his own gift love. This is different from the gift loves he has built into our nature. These never quite seek simply the good of the loved object for the object's own sake. They are biased in favour of those goods they can themselves bestow, or those which they would like best themselves, or those which fit in with a preconceived picture of the life they want the object to lead. But divine gift love, love himself working in a man, is wholly disinterested and desires what is simply best for the beloved. Again, natural gift love is always directed to objects which the lover finds in some way intrinsically lovable, objects to which affection or eros or a shared point of view attracts him, or, failing that, to the grateful and the deserving, or perhaps to those whose helplessness is of a winning and appealing kind. But divine gift love in the man enables him to love what is not naturally lovable: lepers, criminals, enemies, morons, the sulky, the superior, and the sneering. Finally, by a higher paradox, God enables men to have a gift love towards himself. There is, of course, a sense in which no one can give to God anything which is not already his. And if it is his already, what have you given? But since it is only too obvious that we can withhold ourselves, our wills and hearts from God, we can, in that sense, also give them. What is his by right and would not exist for a moment if it ceased to be his, as the song is the singer's, he has nevertheless made ours in such a way that we can freely offer it back to him. Our wills are ours to make them thine. And as all Christians know, there is another way of giving to God. Every stranger whom we feed or clothe is Christ. And this apparently is gift love to God, whether we know it or not. Love himself can work in those who know nothing of him. The sheep in the parable had no idea either of the God hidden in the prisoner whom they visited, or of the God hidden in themselves when they made the visit. I take the whole parable to be about the judgment of the heathen, for it begins by saying in the Greek that the Lord will summon all the nations before him, presumably the Gentiles, the Goyim. That such a gift love comes by grace and should be called charity, everyone will agree. But I have to add something which will not perhaps be so easily admitted. God, as it seems to me, bestows two other gifts: a supernatural need love of himself and a supernatural need love of one another. By the first, I do not mean the appreciative love of himself, the gift of adoration. What little I have to say on that highest subject will come later. I mean a love which does not dream of disinterestedness, a bottomless indulgence, like a river making its own channel, like a magic wine, which in being poured out should simultaneously create the glass that was to hold it. God turns our need of him into need love of him. What is stranger still is that he creates in us a more than natural receptivity of charity from our fellow men. Need is so near greed, and we are so greedy already that it seems a strange grace. But I cannot get it out of my head that this is what happens. Let us consider first this supernatural need love of himself bestowed by grace. Of course, the grace does not create the need. That is there already, given, as the mathematicians say, in the mere fact of our being creatures, and incalculably increased by our being fallen creatures. What the grace gives is the full recognition, the sensible awareness, the complete acceptance, even with certain reservations, the glad acceptance of this need. For without grace, our wishes and our necessities are in conflict. All those expressions of unworthiness which Christian practices put into the believer's mouth seem to the outer world like the degraded and insincere grovellings of a sycophant before a tyrant, or at best a façon de parler, like the self-depreciation of a Chinese gentleman when he calls himself this coarse and illiterate person. In reality, however, they express the continually renewed, because continually necessary, attempt to negate that misconception of ourselves and of our relation to God which nature, even while we pray, is always recommending to us. No sooner do we believe that God loves us than there is an impulse to believe that he does so not because he is love, but because we are intrinsically lovable. The pagans obeyed this impulse unabashed. A good man was dear to the gods because he was good. We, being better taught, resort to subterfuge. Far be it from us to think that we have virtues for which God could love us. But then, how magnificently we have repented. As Bunyan says, describing his first and illusory conversion, I thought there was no man in England that pleased God better than I. Beaten out of this, we next offer our own humility to God's admiration. Surely he'll like that. Or if not that, our clear-sighted and humble recognition that we still lack humility. Thus, depth beneath depth and subtlety within subtlety, there remains some lingering idea of our very own attractiveness. It is easy to acknowledge, but almost impossible to realize for long, that we are mirrors whose brightness, if we are bright, is wholly derived from the sun that shines upon us. Surely we must have a little, however little, native luminosity. Surely we can't be quite creatures. For this tangled absurdity of a need, even a need love, which never fully acknowledges its own neediness, grace substitutes a full, childlike and delighted acceptance of our need, a joy in total dependence. We become jolly beggars. The good man is sorry for the sins which have increased his need. He is not entirely sorry for the fresh need they have produced. And he is not sorry at all for the innocent need that is inherent in his creaturely condition. For all the time, this illusion to which nature clings as her last treasure, this pretense that we have anything of our own or could for 1 hour retain by our own strength any goodness that God may pour into us, has kept us from being happy. We have been like bathers who want to keep their feet or 1 foot or 1 toe on the bottom, when to lose that foothold would be to surrender themselves to a glorious tumble in the surf. The consequences of parting with our last chain to intrinsic freedom, power, or worth are real freedom. Really ours, they are really ours just because God gives them and because we know them to be, in another sense, not ours. Anodos has got rid of this shadow, but God also transforms our need love for one another. And it requires equal transformation. In reality, we all need at times, some of us at most times, that charity from others, which being love himself in them, loves the unlovable. But this, though a sort of love we need, is not the sort we want. We want to be loved for our cleverness, beauty, generosity, fairness, usefulness. The first hint that anyone is offering us the highest love of all is a terrible shock. This is so well recognized that spiteful people will pretend to be loving us with charity precisely because they know that it will wound us. To say to one who expects a renewal of affection, friendship, or eros, I forgive you as a Christian, is merely a way of continuing the quarrel. Those who say it are, of course, lying. But the thing would not be falsely said in order to wound, unless, if it were true, it would be wounding. How difficult it is to receive and to go on receiving from others a love that does not depend on our own attraction. It can be seen from an extreme case. Suppose yourself a man struck down shortly after marriage by an incurable disease which may not kill you for many years. Useless, impotent, hideous, disgusting, dependent on your wife's earnings, impoverishing where you hoped to enrich, impaired, even in intellect, and shaken by gusts of uncontrollable temper, full of unavoidable demands. And suppose your wife's care and pity to be inexhaustible. The man who can take this sweetly, who can receive all and give nothing without resentment, who can abstain even from those tiresome self-depreciations which are really only a demand for petting and reassurance, is doing something which need love in its merely natural condition could not attain. No doubt such a wife will also be doing something beyond the reach of a natural gift love, but that is not the point at present. In such a case, to receive is harder and perhaps more blessed than to give. But what the extreme example illustrates is universal. We are all receiving charity. There is something in each of us that cannot be naturally loved. It is no one's fault if they do not so love it. Only the lovable can be naturally loved. You might as well ask people to like the taste of rotten bread or the sound of a mechanical drill. We can be forgiven and pitied and loved in spite of it with charity, no other way. All who have good parents, wives, husbands, or children may be sure that at some times, and perhaps at all times, in respect of some one particular trait or habit, they are receiving charity, are loved not because they are lovable, but because love himself is in those who love them. Thus God, admitted to the human heart, transforms not only gift love, but need love. Not only our need love of him, but our need love of one another. This is, of course, not the only thing that can happen. He may come on what seems to us a more dreadful mission and demand that a natural love be totally renounced. A high and terrible vocation like Abraham's may constrain a man to turn his back on his own people and his father's house. Eros, directed to a forbidden object, may have to be sacrificed. In such instances, the process, though hard to endure, is easy to understand. What we are more likely to overlook is the necessity for a transformation even when the natural love is allowed to continue. In such a case, the divine love does not substitute itself for the natural, as if we had to throw away our silver to make room for the gold. The natural loves are summoned to become modes of charity while also remaining the natural loves they were. One sees here at once a sort of echo or rhyme or corollary to the incarnation itself, and this need not surprise us, for the author of both is the same. As Christ is perfect God and perfect man, the natural loves are called to become perfect charity and also perfect natural loves. As God becomes man not by conversion of the Godhead into flesh, but by taking on the manhood into God, so here charity does not dwindle into merely natural love, but natural love is taken up into, made the tuned and obedient instrument of love himself. How can this happen? Most Christians know. All the activities, sins only excepted, of the natural loves can in a favoured hour become works of the glad and shameless and grateful need love, or of the selfless, unofficious gift love, which are both charity. Nothing is either too trivial or too animal to be thus transformed. A game, a joke, a drink together, idle chat, a walk, the act of Venus, all these can be modes in which we forgive or accept forgiveness, in which we console or are reconciled, in which we seek not our own. Thus, in our very instincts, appetites, and recreations, love has prepared for himself a body. But I said in a favoured hour. Hours soon pass. The total and secure transformation of a natural love into a mode of charity is a work so difficult that perhaps no fallen man has ever come within sight of doing it perfectly. Yet the law that loves must be so transformed is, I suppose, inexorable. One difficulty is that here, as usual, we can take a wrong turn. A Christian, a somewhat too vocally Christian, circle or family, having grasped this principle, can make a show in their overt behaviour and especially in their words of having achieved the thing itself. An elaborate, fussy, embarrassing, and intolerable show. Such people make every trifle a matter of explicitly spiritual importance, out loud and to one another. To God, on their knees behind a closed door, it would be another matter. They are always unnecessarily asking or insufferably offering forgiveness. Who would not rather live with those ordinary people who get over their tantrums and ours unemphatically, letting a meal, a night's sleep, or a joke mend everything? The real work must be of all our works the most secret. Even as far as possible, secret from ourselves. Our right hand must not know what our left is doing. We have not got far enough if we play a game of cards with the children merely to amuse them or to show them they are forgiven. If this is the best we can do, we are right to do it. But it would be better if a deeper, less conscious charity threw us into a frame of mind in which a little fun with the children was the thing we should at that moment like best. We are, however, much helped in this necessary work by that very feature of our experience at which we most repine. The invitation to turn our natural loves into charity is never lacking. It is provided by those frictions and frustrations that meet us in all of them. Unmistakable evidence that natural love is not going to be enough. Unmistakable unless we are blinded by egotism. When we are, we use them absurdly. If only I had been more fortunate in my children. That boy gets more like his father every day. I could have loved them perfectly. But every child is sometimes infuriating. Most children are not infrequently odious. If only my husband were more considerate, less lazy, less extravagant. If only my wife had fewer moods and more sense, and were less extravagant. If my father wasn't so infernally prosy and close-fisted. But in everyone, and of course in ourselves, there is that which requires forbearance, tolerance, forgiveness. The necessity of practicing these virtues first forces us upon the attempt to turn more strictly, to let God turn our love into charity. These frets and rubs are beneficial. It may even be that where there are fewest of them, the conversion of natural love is most difficult. When they are plentiful, the necessity of rising above it so obvious. To rise above it when it is as fully satisfied and as little impeded as earthly conditions allow. To see that we must rise when all seems so well already. This may require a subtler conversion and a more delicate insight. In this way, also, it may be hard for the rich to enter the kingdom. And yet, I believe the necessity for the conversion is inexorable, at least if our natural loves are to enter the heavenly life. That they can enter it, most of us in fact believe. We may hope that the resurrection of the body means also the resurrection of what may be called our greater body, the general fabric of our earthly life with its affections and relationships, but only on a condition. Not a condition arbitrarily laid down by God, but one necessarily inherent in the character of heaven. Nothing can enter there which cannot become heavenly. Flesh and blood, mere nature, cannot inherit that kingdom. Man can ascend to heaven only because the Christ, who died and ascended to heaven, is formed in him. Must we not suppose that the same is true of a man's loves? Only those into which love himself has entered will ascend to love himself. And these can be raised with him only if they have in some degree and fashion shared his death. If the natural element in them has submitted year after year, or in some sudden agony to transmutation, the fashion of this world passes away. The very name of nature implies the transitory. Natural loves can hope for eternity only insofar as they allow themselves to be taken into the eternity of charity. They have at least allowed the process to begin here on earth, before the night comes when no man can work. And the process will always involve a kind of death. There is no escape. In my love for wife or friend, the only eternal element is the transforming presence of love himself. By that presence, if at all, the other elements may hope, as our physical bodies hope, to be raised from the dead. For this only is holy in them. This only is the Lord. Theologians have sometimes asked whether we shall know one another in heaven, and whether the particular love relations worked out on earth would then continue to have any significance. It seems reasonable to reply it may depend what kind of love it had become or was becoming on earth. For surely, to meet in the eternal world someone for whom your love in this, however strong, had been merely natural, would not be on that ground even interesting. Would it not be like meeting in adult life someone who had seemed to be a great friend at your preparatory school solely because of common interests and occupations? If there was nothing more, if he was not a kindred soul, he will now be a total stranger. Neither of you now plays conkers. You no longer want to swap your help with his French exercise for his help with your arithmetic. In heaven, I suspect, a love that had never embodied love himself would be equally irrelevant, for nature has passed away. All that is not eternal is eternally out of date. But I must not end on this note, I dare not, and all the less because longings and terrors of my own prompt me to do so. Leave any bereaved and desolate reader confirmed in the widespread illusion that reunion with the loved dead is the goal of the Christian life. The denial of this may sound harsh and unreal in the ears of the broken-hearted, but it must be denied. Thou hast made us for thyself, said St. Augustine, and our heart has no rest till it comes to thee. This, So easy to believe for a brief moment before the altar, or perhaps half praying, half meditating in an April wood, sounds like mockery beside a deathbed. But we shall be far more truly mocked if casting this way we pin our comfort on the hope, perhaps even with the aid of seance and necromancy, of some day, this time forever, enjoying the earthly beloved again, and no more. It is hard not to imagine that such an endless prolongation of earthly happiness would be completely satisfying. But, if I may trust my own experience, we get at once a sharp warning that there is something wrong. The moment we attempt to use our faith in the other world for this purpose, that faith weakens. The moments in my life when it was really strong have all been moments when God Himself was central in my thoughts. Believing in Him, I could then believe in heaven as a corollary. But the reverse process, believing first in reunion with the beloved, and then for the sake of that reunion, believing in heaven, and finally, for the sake of heaven, believing in God, this will not work. One can, of course, imagine things, but a self-critical person will soon be increasingly aware that the imagination at work is his own. He knows he is only weaving a fantasy, and simpler souls will find the phantoms they try to feed on void of all comfort and nourishment, only to be stimulated into some semblance of reality by pitiful efforts of self-hypnotism, and perhaps by the aid of ignoble pictures and hymns, and what is worse, witches. We find thus by experience that there is no good applying to heaven for earthly comfort. Heaven can give heavenly comfort, no other kind, and earth cannot give earthly comfort either. There is no earthly comfort in the long run. For the dream of finding our end, the thing we were made for, in a heaven of purely human love, could not be true unless our whole faith were wrong. We were made for God. Only by being in some respect like Him, only by being a manifestation of His beauty, loving kindness, wisdom, or goodness, has any earthly beloved excited our love. It is not that we have loved them too much, but that we did not quite understand what we were loving. It is not that we shall be asked to turn from them, so dearly familiar, to a stranger. When we see the face of God, we shall know that we have always known it. He has been a party to, has made, sustained, and moved moment by moment within all our earthly experiences of innocent love. All that was true love in them was, even on earth, far more His than ours, and ours only because His. In heaven, there will be no anguish and no duty of turning away from our earthly beloveds. First, because we shall have turned already from the portraits to the original, from the rivulets to the fountain, from the creatures He made lovable to love Himself. But secondly, because we shall find them all in Him. By loving Him more than them, we shall love them more than we now do. But all that is far away in the land of the Trinity, not here in exile in the weeping valley. Down here it is all loss and renunciation. The very purpose of the bereavement, so far as it affects ourselves, may have been to force this upon us. We are then compelled to try to believe what we cannot yet feel, that God is our true beloved. That is why bereavement is in some way easier for the unbeliever than for us. He can storm and rage and shake his fist at the universe, and if he is a genius, write poems like Huysmans or Hardy's. But we, at our lowest ebb, when the least effort seems too much for us, must begin to attempt what seems impossible. Is it easy to love God? Asks an old author. It is easy, he replies, to those who do it. I have included 2 graces under the word charity, but God can give a third. He can awake in man towards himself, a supernatural, appreciative love. This is of all gifts the most to be desired. Here, not in our natural loves, nor even in ethics, lies the true centre of all human and angelic life. With this, all things are possible. And with this, where a better book would begin, mine must end. I dare not proceed. God knows, not I, whether I have ever tasted this love. Perhaps I have only imagined the tasting. Those, like myself, whose imagination far exceeds their obedience, are subject to a just penalty. We easily imagine conditions far higher than any we have really reached. If we describe what we have imagined, we may make others and make ourselves believe that we have really been there. And if I have only imagined it, is it a further delusion that even the imagining has at some moments made all other objects of desire, yes, even peace, even to have no more fears, look like broken toys and faded flowers? Perhaps. Perhaps for many of us, all experience merely defines, so to speak, the shape of that gap. Where our love of God ought to be, it is not enough, it is something. If we cannot practice the presence of God, it is something to practice the absence of God, to become increasingly aware of our unawareness till we feel like men who should stand beside a great cataract and hear no noise, or like a man in a story who looks in a mirror and finds no face there, or a man in a dream who stretches out his hand to visible objects and gets no sensation of touch. To know that one is dreaming is to be no longer perfectly asleep. But for news of the fully waking world, you must go to my betters.